The results of the OTA offseason practices that begin this week are not very important for most players on the Jets, but there are exceptions. For Malachi Corley, Qwan'tez Stiggers, and Zack Kuntz, this could be the first step towards carving out a surprise role with the 2025 Jets, or it could be the beginning of the end of their Jets careers. We're breaking down Jets OTAs today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, May 20th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, our focus is going to be on Jets OTAs. OTA stands for Organized Team Activity. It is the third and most intense part of the offseason program. The Jets are beginning these relatively more intense offseason practices this week. And for most players, the results of these practices don't matter all that much. But as I mentioned on yesterday's show, there's a certain type of player for whom these practices can mean quite a bit. Players who are trying to develop, players who are trying to carve out roles. And on today's show, we're going to talk about three players to keep an eye on during the OTAs this week and in the weeks ahead. They are Malachi Corley, Qwan'tez Stiggers, and Zack Kuntz. These are all three players who were very raw when the Jets drafted them. The Jets felt that these players had potential. To date, they really haven't shown much, but they play roles where the Jets aren't necessarily all that deep. And all three of them have a chance to carve out a spot on the 2025 team. However, none of the three of them is guaranteed to be a big part of the team going forward. In fact, I don't think any of the three of them is guaranteed to be on the opening day roster. So the stakes are high. And I closed out yesterday's show talking a bit about OTAs. And for the most part, I'll be honest with you, I'm pretty dismissive of the results of OTAs. People, I think, read way too much into these results. And I think this plays into the time of the year we're in. I think that when you get to May, the NFL draft is over. So there's not much to talk about. Once training camp starts, we'll be focused on the start of the season. Once the season begins, we'll have games to break down. When the season ends, we'll start by previewing free agency. Then free agency comes. Then we preview the draft. Then the draft comes. But that stretch between the draft and the start of training camp, there's just not a lot going on in the NFL calendar. So if you get like a little morsel of news, it tends to be blown out of proportion. And we've seen this, all over the Jets landscape in recent days. Yesterday, I talked about the whole saga of Jamal Adams giving an interview where he said he wanted to return to the team, which was, an interesting interview, but it didn't mean that Jamal Adams was necessarily likely to return to the Jets. I think with OTAs, there's something similar going on where these practices happen and we always hear about the standouts. And I think we put way too much stock into what actually happens at these OTAs. But these OTAs can matter. As I mentioned at the end of yesterday's show, if a player is going to improve, the first place he's going to show it is at these OTAs. And, just because you stand out in these offseason practices, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed to be destined for greatness. But if you're going to show improvement as a player, again, this is where you're going to notice it first. And that's why I've picked these three players as guys to watch. Also, because I think all three of them have talents that the Jets are otherwise lacking. So let's start by talking about Malachi Corley. And of course, the Jets traded up for him in the third round of last year's NFL draft. A really strange pick in retrospect, and not even in retrospect, even in the moment, because Corley was a very, very raw player. I think that anybody who was expecting Malachi Corley to do anything last year was not being realistic. This is a guy who barely ran routes in college. And those are the types of receivers who take a long time to get going in the NFL, if it ever happens. But in addition to that, the Jets also had the least tolerant quarterback of receivers not running routes in Aaron Rodgers in the league. One of the least tolerant quarterbacks of receivers not running proper routes in the history of the NFL. So always a bit of a mismatch when the Jets drafted Corley for an Aaron Rodgers-led team. Now we're entering year two. And if we're going to be honest, Corley did not show a whole lot last year. I mean, I think his most memorable play came on Halloween night where the Jets designed a perfect handoff for him. They blocked it up perfectly. It should have been a walk-in touchdown. It would have been a walk-in touchdown for practically any receiver in the league, but Corley dropped the ball at the 1 yard line and it rolled out of the end zone for a touchback. That was about the only memorable play he had last year. And again, none of that's a big surprise because in college, Corley was essentially a running back who lined up at wide receiver. And his team just like threw him screens. And I think the theory behind it was, he's bigger. So put him against smaller defensive backs instead of having him run up the middle against defensive linemen and linebackers, let him run over corners and safeties. And it worked very well in college. It's not the type of thing that works as well in the NFL. You can't really live in the NFL as a receiver on screens alone. And I think that Corley's roster spot, I've mentioned this before. I'm not saying Corley's going to get cut. I'm not guaranteeing you that Malachi Corley will not be on the team in 2025. But I'm not sure he has a guaranteed spot on the roster, and that's just due to the number of receivers the Jets have. It's not that I like the Jets receiver room, but I think the coaching staff's a little bit more comfortable with it than I am. We can put Garrett Wilson aside because Garrett Wilson's a great receiver. He's a legitimate number one receiver. I don't know that the Jets have another starting caliber receiver on this roster right now. I mean, is Allen Lazard a starting caliber receiver at this point? That's debatable. I don't think Tyler Johnson ever was. If Josh Reynolds ever was, that was years ago. Arian Smith's a rookie. Irv Charles is a special teamer. Xavier Gibbs has never really shown anything. So it's this really interesting dynamic because on the one hand, the Jets have a lot of players and a lot of players who could end up on the roster because, again, I think the coaching staff's probably higher on Josh Reynolds than I am. I think they're probably higher on Tyler Johnson than I am. I mean, they brought these guys in. But if somebody really flashes in the offseason and then in training camp, the number 2 receiver spot's there for the taking. And I think we know that this offense, the passing game, is going to be run through Garrett Wilson, in part because Justin Fields was his college quarterback. So Fields and Wilson have a pre-existing chemistry, but also because there's really not many other places to go with the football. I think Garrett Wilson is once again going to be in the top 5 in targets in the NFL. And part of that just the targets have to be funneled to him. Even if Garrett through his career has been a heavy target guy who struggled with efficiency. And the reason he struggled with efficiency is that there have been no other quality receiving options on the team. So the balls had to go to him even when even in the instances where he hasn't been able to get open. So there's a real opportunity here. And we know that Garrett Wilson's going to draw the number 1 corner every week. Garrett Wilson's going to draw the other team's attention. Garrett Wilson's going to draw the double teams. So who's playing aside from Garrett Wilson? They're going to get one-on-one matchups. For Corley, what it comes down to is the ability to run routes. And that's the most critical thing for a receiver. We always obsess over speed. We obsess over size. But the question that's really the determining factor in whether you have success or failure as a receiver is, can you get open? Corley, to get open, you need to run routes effectively. Corley never really showed any ability to run routes. He was never really asked to run routes in college. So, I mean, it's not really his fault, but it's time for him to show something. And the opening's there because there's no real guaranteed starting receiver on this roster other than Garrett Wilson. So what you want to hear from OTAs for Corley is that the route running looks a lot better. It's night and day that he's really taken to it. He's really taken to the new coaching staff. Even if Corley ends up being somebody who's not a quality number 2 receiver, even if he becomes like a 3rd or 4th option in the passing game, that would still be leaps ahead of where he was at the end of last season. So this is the dynamic for Malachi Corley. There's nobody out there who really a big challenge to be a part of this passing game. But there are lots of guys who are contenders to have a spot on the roster. So Malachi Corley has to justify his continued existence. If he can, he actually may play a role in this passing game. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defensive backfields. Qwan'tez Stiggers has a very interesting profile when the Jets drafted him a year ago. In fact, they drafted him out of the CFL. He was one of Robert Saleh's favorite prospects. But with a new coaching staff, there may not be a spot for him at corner. However, there might be an opening at a different position. We'll talk about that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And of course, if you're a Knicks fan, I mean, it's like we're back in the 1990s, Eastern Conference Finals, Knicks versus Pacers. We've seen that a couple of times in the distant past, but the Knicks and Pacers are playing in the Eastern Conference Finals. You want the Knicks to win and you want to win big, FanDuel's the place to get in on the action, and you could also get in the action for the Jets in the upcoming season. FanDuel's only got them with an over-under of 5.5 wins. You think they're going to clear that? Well, head on over to FanDuel. New to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet, and if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're talking about Jets OTAs. The finals phase of the offseason practice program begins this week, and there are some players I think these OTAs matter for. In our first segment, we discussed Malachi Corley, another guy who I think he has a shot to carve out a role, but also could be in danger with his roster spot if things don't go well, is Qwan'tez Stiggers, who the Jets drafted a year ago. And we know that Qwan'tez Stiggers was the Jets were very high on Qwan'tez Stiggers, Robert Saleh in particular. In fact, if you go back a few months, I had a podcast guest quote Robert Saleh saying that Qwan'tez Stiggers was going to be a starter in the NFL. Very quiet rookie season for Qwan'tez Stiggers. He did not get on the field much. A guy with an amazing story. In fact, I'm sure no matter how the rest of his career plays out, his story is going to be made into a movie where he was at a small school. His father tragically died in a car accident, and the grief led him to drop out of school. His mother signed him up for this minor indoor professional football league. He caught the eye of somebody who worked in the Canadian Football League, ended up signing in the CFL with the Toronto Argonauts, and then got drafted in the NFL. And that's just an amazing story. No matter what happens with Qwan'tez Stiggers, it's just what an incredible path to be drafted in the NFL and make the NFL and play in NFL games. The question, though, is can we make the story even better? Can Qwan'tez Stiggers become a player in this league? And it wasn't entirely clear what the Jets viewed Qwan'tez Stiggers at last year, because there was talk maybe they viewed him as an outside corner. Maybe they viewed him as a slot corner, or maybe they viewed him as a safety. At this point, Qwan'tez Stiggers' ability to find a starting role as a corner might be limited in New York. Of course, Sauce Gardner's here, and if all goes well, Sauce Gardner will be here for the bulk of his career. Jets need to work out a long-term extension with him, and now would be a good time to do so. But over the course of this offseason, the Jets also signed Brandon Stevens from Baltimore to a fairly lucrative contract. He'll be the other starting outside corner this year. And then they drafted Zaire Thomas in the third round. And Thomas is a bit of a project player. And, when there's a new coaching staff, a new GM in town, it's a fresh start for everybody. So, if you were a guy the old coaching staff overlooked, you have a real opportunity to prove yourself. But there's a flip side. If you were kind of like a favorite project player of the old coaching staff and GM, you could be in danger, because every coach and every GM, they have players that they like as projects, and they always cut these guys slack. Even if you haven't proven yourself in year one or year two, they'll give you another chance. And that's just like we all have our biases. Coaches and GMs are the same way. They have people that they just like. They have people that they keep around and give extra chances to. I think Qwan'tez Stiggers might have been one of those guys for Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. Again, like we know for a fact, Saleh really liked him. With Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji around, it may not be such a clear path for Stiggers. And that doesn't mean he's necessarily destined to be cut. It doesn't mean that his Jets career is doomed. It just means he's got to show something to justify his continued spot on the roster. But you look at the safety position for the Jets. I mean, you've got Andre Cisco, who I like. I think that was actually a pretty good signing the Jets made from Jacksonville. In fact, of the players the Jets imported this offseason in free agency, I think Cisco was the best one. I really like that signing. I think he's a good bounce back candidate. He was a guy who had been a good player for the Jaguars prior to a disaster 2024, but the entire 2024 season was a disaster for the Jaguars. I mean, hey, we can relate, right? There were players on the Jets in 2024 who did not play to their normal level to their normal caliber of play. And I think part of it was just the situation was so disjointed and so dysfunctional that at some point it drags everybody down. And I think that happened with a lot of Jets players in 2024. I think it may have happened with Cisco and Jacksonville. But outside of that, I mean, there's not a lot at the safety position. You have the Tony Adams, who's an incumbent starter. Tony Adams is a guy who's fine to have out there until somebody better comes along. I mean, that's the best way I can put it. I don't think anybody's going to look at Tony Adams and view a guy who's going to start for you for 5 years. He's a guy who, on his best day, does a good enough job to be on the field, but he's never really that big of an impact player. Then you have Malachi Moore, who, look, I like Malachi Moore. I've stated that I think even as a 4th round pick, he may end up challenging for a starting role again. Now, part of that's just due to the competition being Tony Adams, but Qwan'tez Stiggers, there's an opportunity here at the safety position. The door may be closed at corner. And that was one of the big questions heading into the offseason because, heading into the offseason, Jets had DJ Reed about to hit free agency. So it felt like if Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji really liked Qwan'tez Stiggers, perhaps there would be an opportunity for him to start at outside corner. Now with the signing of Brandon Stevens and the drafting of Azariah Thomas, that door is closed. And it does put Stiggers in some degree of danger because that path is not looking very clear right now for him. But again, when the Jets drafted him, and again, I know it was a different regime, it wasn't entirely clear where he was going to end up. So maybe safety is the spot where he ends up. And it's not like the competition's that steep there. So real opportunity, I think, for Qwan'tez Stiggers. But at the same time, anybody who was a day 3 pick of the previous regime can't be feeling too safe about their roster spots. It's very easy for GMs to cut the previous GM's guy. It's much tougher to draft a guy and then cut him a year later if you're the one who did the drafting. But when the previous guy did the drafting, very easy to move on. So for Qwan'tez Stiggers, it's not a case where he's doomed, but it is a case where he probably needs to prove himself. He needs to prove his continued presence on the roster is justified. But if he does, well, again, there's a pretty big opportunity here because there's just not a lot of talent at the safety position. And having a guy like Stiggers around as a safety still would have an additional benefit for the Jets because he's got experience at corner. So he's the type of guy who, if you had an emergency in a game where you suffered like 3 injuries at corner and needed somebody in a pinch, having somebody like that playing safety is helpful because you could move him to corner for the short term. So it'd be interesting to see what happens, what comes out with Qwan'tez Stiggers. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to one more player, a guy who generated a lot of hype for a 7th round pick when the Jets picked him, and that was Zack Kuntz. In 2 years, he really has not made much progress, but because of the lack of talent at the tight end position, there is still an opportunity for him to carve out a role, even if it's not the starting role. We'll discuss Zack Kuntz more as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Tuesday, we're talking about OTAs, organized team activities, which begin this week for the New York Jets. It is the final phase of the offseason program, and to the extent there's intensity in the offseason program, this is it. This is the phase that at least most resembles a real practice, and it's easy to get carried away with prognostications based on what happens at OTAs, but there are players these matter for. And I've spoken, if you're a longtime listener, I've spoken with players about this in the past. And universally, when I've interviewed players that I've asked about the importance of OTAs, I've gotten the same results. And that's that I've been told that they're not very important for the established guys. They're not important for Garrett Wilson. They're not important for Quinnen Williams. They're not important for Sauce Gardner. They're not important for Quincy Williams. But they are important for younger guys trying to develop because it's an opportunity to get on the practice field and compete. It's an opportunity to show the coaches what you're capable of. And it's an opportunity to show if you've made improvement over the course of the offseason. And one guy who I think needs to show improvement because he really, from watching him, he hasn't looked like he's any better from the day the Jets drafted him, is Zack Kuntz. And for a 7th round pick, Kuntz got a lot of attention, and it was really based on his athletic testing. There's this metric, relative athletic score. You may have heard of it. It's called RAS. A lot of people refer to it as RAS. Kuntz scored a perfect 10 on that. He was the most athletic tight end by this metric drafted since 1987. So he just dominated the athletic testing portion of of the process. Unfortunately, you need to be able to play football effectively. There's the old expression: are you a football player who's a great athlete, or are you an athlete playing football? And to this point in his career, Zack Kuntz has been an athlete playing football. You see this every year. Some guy with an uber athletic profile gets drafted in the late rounds. The fan base falls in love with him. The fan base gushes over him, and then he never really develops. And I think it's fair to say through the first 2 years of Zack Kuntz's career, that's been the case. Lots of hype when the Jets drafted him. Hasn't really justified any of the hype. In fact, has been relegated to the practice squad. But you look at the Jets tight end position. After Tyler Conklin leaves, what is there? Well, there's Mason Taylor, who I would say is probably the presumed number one tight end heading into the season. But after that, you have Jeremy Ruckert. And, I feel bad for saying this because I'm really hard on Ruckert. But Ruckert's another guy who really hasn't developed at all. If you watch him through much of his career, he's been tough to put on the field. He's dropped a lot of passes. He hasn't run good routes. His blocking has been overhyped. He can throw the occasional good block, but he's not a very consistent blocker. So your number two tight end is going to see a decent amount of playing time. I don't think it's like that crazy to think that Kuntz could improve to the point where he could be a second tight end. Now, I think it's pretty clear the Jets are viewing Mason Taylor as their number one tight end moving forward. And that's right. He was a good prospect who the Jets drafted on day 2. I think in an ideal world, you'd have something better as a tight end 1, and Mason Taylor could come along at his own pace, but Taylor's going to be thrown into the lineup. And I do think getting those game reps early will probably benefit him in the long run. But behind Taylor, again, Ruckert's the number 2 tight end. Ruckert is not a steep challenge if Kuntz can develop. And listen, we've seen this time after time after time where, guys really athletic at tight ends and can't put it together. If you're a longtime Jets fan, you may remember Jeff Cumberland, who was a non-drafted free agent. Jets signed in 2011 and put together a few semi-credible seasons, but there was real hope that Jeff Cumberland could develop into a quality number 1 tight end. That never really happened during his time with the Jets. For Kuntz, the goal is not as lofty. For Kuntz, we have our number 1 tight end going forward in Mason Taylor. For Kuntz, it's a question, can he develop into a second tight end? The one challenge for him is that second tight ends typically need to block. In addition to not running good routes or showing good hands when he's gotten opportunities in the exhibition season, Kuntz has not really shown himself to be much of a blocker, but he's not undersized. This is not a guy with a wide receiver build playing tight end. He is at about 250 pounds. So he's got the frame where, if he could learn technique, he should be able to be an effective blocker. But this is I'd be lying to you if I told you this was not a major developmental project. In fact, most of the players we mentioned on today's show need a lot of work. I think of the 3, Stiggers is probably the one that's closest to competing, and that's because he actually had some success on a professional level playing in the CFL in Toronto. Malachi Corley is a guy who's very, very raw as a receiver, and Kuntz may even be rawer as a tight end. And he's been in the league for 2 years already. The Jets drafted him in 2023. It's not. I don't mean to make it sound like any of this is going to be easy, particularly for Kuntz, because it's not easy to learn how to run routes. I think sometimes we overestimate the coach's ability to teach a guy starting from scratch to be able to do that. That's something Kuntz needs to learn to do. It's certainly not easy blocking dominant NFL defensive linemen. These guys are explosive athletes. They're very big. They're well-versed on technique. These are things that are harder to do. And, when the Jets drafted him, I think that was something that was lost, is coaches can make a difference in a player's career, but ultimately the player is the one that has the biggest burden of development on them. Maybe a new coaching staff can get through to Kuntz in a way that Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbricht's coaching staff could not, but it is still quite a difficult path. That said, there is not a lot of competition there, and that's the silver lining for these guys. All 3 of them, they could end up being players for this team. Even if they're not starters, even if Corley is like a number 3 receiver, even if Stiggers is like a guy who plays in dime packages, or even if Kuntz is the number 2 tight end, there's an opportunity to carve out a role. The question, though, is can they show enough to to earn that role? And can they show enough to earn a roster spot? We'll keep our eyes on it. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on the podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will plan to have our weekly mailbag. Can't wait to talk to you then.